Thanks so much to our partners. As you know, the CHTA is nowhere without collaborators, and we have two great ones here joining us in the webinar today to walk us through GDPR, which is an impending data protection regulation that will be enforced by the EU. Has major implications for all of those managing data, which would include all of us. Really with the end goal of making us all better stewards, more respectful stewards of consumer data. So on the line today, we have Brian Kent, who is the CEO and co-founder of Flip2, a strategic partner of the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association. Brian J. Kent is the CEO and co-founder of Flip2, the advocacy platform that helps destinations and hotels reach, inspire, and convert an entirely new global audience every day. Brian is a Brooklyn-born, NYC-raised, half-time Orlando dweller who is as comfortable with hyphens as he is in design, engineering, product development, strategy, and all-around good company building. Thank you, Brian, and welcome. Polly Pickering is also on the line with us. She's the managing director of eShore Limited. Polly Pickering is an IT security solutions and business continuity specialist, as well as an offshore AML enthusiast. She is a founding member of the International Association of Certified Compliance Specialists, the IACCS. As the managing director of eShore Cayman Limited, she is familiar with the challenges surrounding disaster recovery, IT governance, security, and data sovereignty. Thank you, Polly, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
All righty, so we're going to begin our presentation with Brian, correct?
Yep. Hey, good morning, everyone.
All righty.
So thanks, everyone, for joining. What I was going to kick off with what GDPR is, and also what it means for your business, both in terms of the short term and the long term. And I was going to pass it off to Polly to kind of walk you through more of the technical compliance of GDPR. So at a high level, what is GDPR? It's a new regulation that the European Union put out that really evolves how companies handle both privacy and data. Next. Next slide. Some would say that GDPR wiped out the dinosaurs, but that's not exactly how the EU likes to describe it. Next. The EU describes it in an 88-page regulation as the new law that imposes a strict set of requirements on how and why companies collect and use personal data. So there's really two pieces of it, and it breaks down to the how and the why. So the how is all about the protection of someone's personal data and their rights to it. So what does that mean? So what it means that for what the EU is trying to get across is companies now have to provide the right to individuals to know what data a company has about you, which in the past, it wasn't as transparent, right? You didn't know exactly what a company had on you. It also is requiring the right that a company that's handling your data is doing it in a really secure way, as well as being good stewards of it so that whoever they're passing that data along to, their partners and what they call processors of your data is also handling it well. So the onus is on the company that you're interacting with, that they're protecting it, even with the folks that they're working with. It also adds the requirement that you have the right to be forgotten. The data is yours. You're allowed to wipe it, meaning that you can send in a request to any of the different companies or organizations that may have data on you and say, you know what, I don't want you having my data anymore. So can you please wipe it? And the company is required within a reasonable period of time to wipe that data, right? So that's the how of the protection of how companies collect and use personal data. And Polly is going to get into a bit more of, what is considered personal data, what's considered secure personal data, and how to go about protecting it. The other piece of that is the why. So it's all about the usage of that data. So why do you have data to begin with? So the idea that a company can use data for reasonable uses for a reasonable time frame is what this is all about, right? They're not trying to, restrict you from using data, but they want to ensure that it's being used with the right intentions. It also means that you have to get very specific consents to why, for a company, why a company is reaching back to talk to someone, right? So the idea that previously that you can get someone's data, whether it was, just a list that someone shared with you, or you just have an old database that you can just simply email out at any point whenever you want, that's kind of going away, right? And I'll speak to what that means to you both into the short term and the long term. So the EU GDPR is going into effect May 25th. Next slide. That gives you about 50 days. So the bad news is that it's pending. The good news is that 50 days gives you enough time to at least wrap your head around it, right? You may not be overly familiar with it, or you may be somewhat familiar with it, or you may have a task force already up and running, and now it's great. But you still have time to at least understand it and start getting into compliance, because there's some good reasons to do that. Aside from the being a good steward of data and getting into better communication with folks, there's some real risks. Next slide. So what are the risks, right? There's a few different ones. There's the big ones that the GDPR includes as real penalties if you're not in compliance with its new regulation. Next slide. So here's the teeth. The teeth for this regulation is that at the lower level, meaning that if you're in non-technical compliance, meaning that you're trying to get in compliance, but you're not doing something right, the fine is the potential of a 10 million euro fine or 2% of your annual revenue, whichever is higher. And at the higher level, it's a fine of 20 million euro or 4% of your annual revenue, whichever is higher. And what that is if you're actually not in compliance with the actual rules and regulations. So that's the teeth that's built in to this particular regulation and this law that's actually pretty new. There's been a data protection law on the books for a while, but didn't have this type of penalty or such a harsh penalty imposed if you're not in compliance. So there's that risk. But the reality is for most businesses, I don't think that's something that you have to, be extremely concerned about, at least not in the short term, right? But because you're probably not going to get fined on May 26th, the day after this goes live. But what this is doing is opening up a really big liability. And so what does that mean? There's other risks that this is opening up. Next slide. So here are two other risks, right? So because this is opening up an entirely new liability, it means that you can potentially have your entire marketing database impacted if your legal counsel, your security team, your compliance team, any of the folks who are looking at this liability and then raise the question, are we in compliance with GDPR, because there's this looming liability out there. And what that means is that, it could be that, your marketing database, that could be an asset that you've built up over years, perhaps even decades, could be at risk because you may not be able to continue using it because you're not in compliance. And I'll get into what that means, of what compliance a little bit more, because it actually affects everyone in travel. It's not just folks who are limited to being based in the EU. This is a common misconception. The other risk there is that, even your insurance provider, whether you have insurance for these types of liabilities, eShore offers data breach liability. I'm sure they'll be offering some insurance for this type of liability. It also speaks to your third parties, right? So if your third parties have liability insurance, meaning that they have errors and omissions insurance that covers this liability, that they may not be able to continue working with you if your data and your email lists and you're not in compliance, because they're still required to be compliant. So if you're working with a third party, a processor of your data who's either sending emails on your behalf or doing some form of personalization, they may tell you that they can't continue doing business as usual until you're in compliance. So that's a real risk, and that's something that I think, if you're looking at what may happen in the days, weeks, months after GDPR goes live, that's the one that should stand out, and you should be, wow, this is something that I really need to pay attention to. The head in the sand approach and waiting to see what happens is not something that you should roll the dice with, because again, it could be something that overnight you have this great asset that you built out that you could potentially no longer use, right? Next slide. So one of the other things about GDPR, before I get into what GDPR means for your business, is that it's pretty fuzzy, right? So it's 88 pages of regulation. There's really no experts on GDPR yet, me included, because no one really knows exactly how it's going to be implemented. So the regulation speaks to kind of some of the different goals and requirements, but doesn't necessarily speak to very specific ways to go about implementing it. So there's probably going to be a period of time where best practices are still being figured out, and people are going to decide how much of this applies to me, how much of it doesn't. But it's really something that is very far-reaching and is very unique from a lot of the other regulations that have gone out previously, because it is something that affects almost everybody, right? And that's something that didn't happen in other international regulations. They didn't really flow down and affect small businesses or even marketing departments as directly. And this one is the most far-reaching yet. Next slide. So what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my business, right? You can read through the 88 pages of the GDPR, but how does it affect you, specifically folks in travel? Next slide. Well, the interesting thing about GDPR is that it actually affects all of us in travel, since it protects the privacy of not just EU citizens, it's anyone who transacted while in the EU, whether they're a citizen to the area or not. So, if you're still trying to figure out what GDPR is all about, I mean, now is definitely the time to start doing the research. One of the good resources is Adweek. They actually posted a pretty good piece on how it affects marketers around the world. And they spelled it out pretty clearly. The GDPR is an initiative that means global companies, everything from giant multinationals all the way down to small business, small online retailers who use EU citizens' data, or anyone who's present in the EU, are subject to comply, right? So that's actually a really big deal. It means that anyone who's had any interaction at any point with anyone who is even present in the EU has to comply with GDPR. So there's some really immediate short-term ramifications, and then there's some long-term wins that come out of complying with GDPR. So in the short term, it means that you really need to focus on your database. If you're looking at your database today and you don't know if you've engaged with even a single individual while in the EU, you're now opening up a liability that puts that entire database at risk. And I don't really want to understate that, because it only takes one drop of poison to ruin that entire well. And Polly can speak to that a bit more because they work with hundreds of law firms, but it's genuinely something that is really problematic. And the real rub in the short term is that it's really difficult to actually get into compliance after GDPR goes live, because a lot of the ways that are for you to go back and to reach out to folks that are in your database to get into compliance are actually breaking compliance with GDPR. Right. So next slide. So short-term wins. The first thing is you need to effectively save your database, right? Take a look at what you have today. And it doesn't matter if you have 1%, 5%, 10%, even if you have one person that you may have interacted with, or you don't know, even if you've interacted with anyone from the EU, you have to take a look and see if your database is in compliance. If you have, it's segmented by who's EU, who's non-EU, the right level of compliance fields associated with each of those folks, and making sure that you're doing everything that is required of you to be a good steward of personal data, meaning that you have in place the ability to deliver to someone who asks for their data to give a download of that data, or at least be prepared to do that. If they ask to remove themselves from your database and your partner's databases, you have to be able to go back to them and give them an answer of saying, yes, we're doing that, and the time frame of when that's going to happen. It also means that, in the short term, you're protecting your customers, right? So this isn't a bad thing, right? So, I mean, the other risk here is almost the PR thing where, the public relations of showing that you're a good steward of data is a win for you, right? So, I mean, GDPR, you can argue whether the implementation of it is is too far-reaching, it's too burdensome, but its goals of helping, protect individuals' rights to privacy and to the rights of their data is well-intentioned. And I think it's a good thing, especially in light of kind of what you're seeing going on kind of around the world with privacy, from what's happening with Facebook to all the way up to advertisers pulling back from their digital spends because they're not sure kind of what's happening, right? Who's this is reaching, and if they're protecting their consumers' data. So that's kind of the short term. The long term, next slide, really means that you need to shift your thinking. And this also isn't a bad thing. In the long term, what it means is you have to think about getting into better, more personal conversations that serve the needs of your consumers. And in our case, it's travelers, in a way that ties back to them. That's also a really good thing, because if you're doing that, it's not just about getting into compliance with GDPR, protecting someone's data, making sure that you're reaching back to folks who raised their hands and said, yes, I'm willing to continue the conversation, but it's actually forcing you to become a better marketer. It means that you're in a more transactional conversation with someone. It also means that you're building and nurturing a relationship rather than just falling back to the idea of, let me just go get a whole bunch of emails and we just continue blasting out to these folks whenever I want, whenever I need, because that was never really good marketing, right? So, to kind of sum it up, GDPR is coming. It's really important for everyone in the travel industry to understand it, start down the path of getting into compliance with it, because there's risks from real monetary penalties, also to risks of your marketing database and all of those assets not being able to continue being used if you're not in compliance because of your privacy teams, legal teams, third parties who say they can't work with you because you're not in compliance, and that could happen sooner than you think. But for your business, It's kind of the short term. When you get into compliance, you're becoming a better steward, and the long term about this is going to make you kind of rethink your relationships with your customers in a way that's probably going to make you a better marketer. And, as we like to say, at Flip2, travel is one of the best products to sell. Let's do a better job at selling it. Let's build relationships over the long term with our partners. GDPR is an opportunity to kind of springboard into doing just that.
Very true.
Okay, next up we have Polly. Are you there?
Yeah, thanks very much, guys. And I do think that was a great summation there, Brian. Thank you very much. I think the bottom line for a lot of folks in the Caribbean right now is how do we know where to find that needle in a haystack? You mentioned a lot about, looking through databases, and the real unfortunate bottom line is we have to look at all the data now. It's impossible to try and determine who has what passport. So it means we have to treat the whole thing as a new game-changing way, and there may be some positives like Brian mentioned. So I think one of the first things I wanted to do is just mention how there's opportunity in this as well. As Brian mentioned, there's some plus. It makes us better, stronger marketers, and it also helps us look at the data we have, we're responsible for, and keep things a bit safe and secure. So I think I wanted to start off on some of the muddy stuff that we can get through, like the legal definition of GDPR. When we talk about personal data being defined within GDPR as any information relating to an identified or identifiable nature of a person, that's your data subject. And basically, any identifiable person can be directly or indirectly referenced by a name, identification number, national insurance number, address, email address, physical specifics regarding them, genetic, mental, cultural, social. So that's an awful lot of data that could be harvested that people are now saying you need to know what it is you have, where it's at, how safe it's kept, and what you're going to do with it. A few times Brian mentioned the right to be forgotten. So I want to kind of just dig into some of his presentation to clarify a few things. There is a right to be forgotten, but it cannot supersede any of your current regulations. So if you happen to be an entity that has to keep records for 7 years for whatever purpose, you cannot supersede that local regulation. And it's important that you also note that as long as you can show that you're a good custodian of the information and you do have a note that when the time comes they will be purged, you don't have to take on the task of purging it immediately. So that's important to know. The other important thing to know is that when you talk about travel sector, the type of data and sources. So I think it's important that you realize it's more than just passport details or where people come from. It can be something as generic as health complaints, allergic reactions. There's a lot of information, and that's where that needle in a haystack comes from, is how much information is relevant and who's the judge. So I wanted to just mention one of the things that Brian didn't touch on, which is when we talked about the fines, they seem very scary, but it's also important to know that these fines are not something that the GDPR is looking to reach out and make an example of people. This is not scaremongering. They would be working through regulators, and there's a process in which you can all go to the ICO, the UK Information Commissioner's Office, ICO UK, where there's a lot of helpful information. They have step-by-step guidebooks that you can look through. And then in there they talk about what the process would be if someone was not compliant. And that's one of the things that people aren't really focusing on, is what would happen if I got a phone call? Who's going to call me? The answer is it's going to be your regulator locally who's going to act on behalf of the EU. And one of the things they're going to do is have corrective powers. For instance, they can issue a reprimand, and they can talk about the infringements, and they can also order certain actions to happen before penalties would be imposed. So they're going to be looking at regulatory corrective powers, as they call it. And this is important because there is no crystal ball, and no one wants to be part of the first breach or the example that the EU might make out of a Caribbean tourism operator. But we don't also want to be part of an embarrassment situation. And I'm just going to give you a quick personal note. For example, on the ICO website, I found that certain businesses are exempt. If you're a charitable organization or you're a micro business, you should take a look to see whether or not you're actually going to be in that mix. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to look at is the difference of what is data in the GDPR. So when we look at the difference between information, the first critical step is to conduct probably an internal audit of all the personal data processing that your organization does. Data mapping, we call it. If your association has policies and procedures around this activity, you're off to a good start. And this needs to include the type of information you collect and what you do with it and how you process it. And one of the things that my coworkers do really well is we talk about how to secure the information around it, how long you retain it, how do you archive your emails, how do you make sure you have good endpoint protection, good old-fashioned antivirus, what are you doing to make sure the information isn't breached. These are the type of things we talk about when we're getting ready to look at the internal audit. Do you need, on the slide, a data protection officer? Or can compliance handle these mandates for you? Are you going to have an action plan? Is it part of your business continuity plan or a separate plan if you have a data breach? And then again, it comes back to, again, what are we doing that's lawful in regards to how we handle and what we do with people's personal data? Next slide. So when we talk about the myths, let's just dispel those real quickly. So we have myth number one, which is we're a Caribbean-based company. GDPR doesn't apply to us. Pamela and I were just in Bahamas a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking to some folks, and they were saying that they're waiting to hear from their regulator what might be the best approach for GDPR. And that's really important for people to know, that there is no magic pill that's going to come from any tourism association, body, or regulator. The EU will have you, the organization, be subject to GDPR. The second myth is it's upstream. My cloud provider or my parent company, or I get the information from another association, they must be responsible. That myth is dispelled where everyone shares the responsibility for GDPR. If you have any personal data, it doesn't matter if it resides in a cloud or in your filing cabinet, you're still responsible for GDPR policies and knowing what to do around good governance. Next slide, please. So, and the third myth is that our personal data, the parent company obviously is taking care of it. Again, any collected data under the EU, anything based on a person's name, ID, genetic information, other factors, needs to be protected cooperatively. So some of the things that we're looking at is how can you do things in the real time between the next 50 days, like Brian mentioned. And I think one of the things we have to look at is very simply taking a look at what information we have. So we have, oops, sorry, come back to, that's a good slide. Next slide, thanks. There we go, Adriana, next slide. Great. So how can we protect our business? Well, one of the things we can do is taking a look at what we have for opt-out policies. This is an easy one. Basically, if the tourism and leisure operators look at the third-party data, how it's being shared, what we are doing around standards, and in particular, if you understand what data sellers have told you about the transfer of data. You may be buying lists, and so you need to have a policy down from the people who you're buying your data sources from. And I think one of the other big things that people need to look at when they're talking about purchase data is what are the privacy notices? You have to explain to individuals how you've obtained data, on what basis, how is it consented to, and in particular for any tourism operator, what are your plans to now do with the data? How are you going to secure it, and how are you going to keep it up to date? So I think that is, as Brian mentioned, maybe there's actually an opportunity to do things a little better, to get our houses in order, to know what we're processing, have some conditions around it, and then put those internal and policies up on our website and let people know how respectful we're going to be as a tourism operator. Next slide. So again, let's look at the data. We've got passports, we've got health complaints, we've got financial and payment information, HR records, any kind of personal preference of travel patterns. A lot of these things are going to come from like Google Analytics. So one of the things you have to do is let people know on your website, what are you tracking and tracing for information, and how are you going to use it, and give people, most importantly, that option to opt out. Next slide. So again, when we talk about key to marketers rather, how to handle that data. So here's some real takeaways. And again, Adriana will make sure that everyone gets a copy of these slides. You need to make sure that all of your data is unbundled. It can't be one lump sum, tick this box, I agree to all of your conditions, like we do when we take our Apple download updates. So once you have it specific, where people can say, in regards to my personal data, my email, I want to be opted in or opted out. And you can't have those boxes pre-ticked. They have to be open, and people actually have to have an action to do it themselves. The next thing is the granular. You basically have to have separation of different things you're asking people regarding their email address, regarding coupons, regarding do you want us to keep your health records for your next trip. These things all have to be unbundled and granular. And then you have to name any third parties who will be also sharing the consent with you or relying on consent. You can say, we share this information with the Caribbean Tourism Association or XYZ Cruise Company. You need to actually call out the third parties you're engaged with. And then obviously the last thing is people have to be able to withdraw as easy as it was to come into consent. Again, if you have that right to be forgotten note, you do need to let people that know that you're going to be with holding data within your own country laws with data protection policies also included. Next slide, please. So this is a good example of how somebody might do something where they have a third-party preference, they have 3 different boxes that people have to tick, and then they have a final, yes, I understand your terms and conditions. But you're keeping it in a very detailed, simple format, but you're asking people to give multiple levels of consent. And then that's the big thing you also have to do in the back office, in your policies that you then would have to present to a GDPR audit. You'll have to tell them how you're maintaining those records, where they're stored, how they're protected, what you're doing for any of your dynamic content, and then basically build a case for why your business is GDPR compliant. Next slide. Now the last big point that I have, then I have a few miscellaneous items, is how to handle any data breaches gracefully. And this is one of the things our company does, is we help people keep things in a safe and secure place and know that if they have a breach, how are they alerted before obviously anybody else knows about it in the public. We use the example of Equifax as how not to handle data breach. Within a few weeks of that, actually, there was a good example of how someone did handle it well, which was Deloitte. I mean, many people don't even remember the data breach that happened last September because it was handled very well publicly. It was dealt with, and within a matter of days, it was out of the press. So all we hope is we can prove that by having the right controls up front, by having the right either IT widgets, having the right policies written from your compliance departments, GDPR would ask that you show that you're putting your best foot forward. And you can, again, go to this ICO website, walk through the 12 steps that they have, and I'm happy to forward anybody the links that we have. Just drop me an email, because I think that that will show that your business has addressed it and that you're taking the time to review what any business of any size would be expected of. Next slide. So one of the things when we talk about the different areas of security, there's email security, making sure that you have a good archive, you're using a good, strong email gateway that has good filtering, good anti-phishing, good spam protection. That's one of the things internally you can do. Good web security, again, checking to see what you have for your website providers. What are they doing with Google Analytics? What are they doing with information as it flows through your website? Security awareness in your organization in regards to your employees so that they know that you're going through this as a company and as an organization. And let your public know, let your clients know that you're doing awareness training. I can't stress enough about endpoint security. We used to call it antivirus, but it's so much more these days. One of the clients that we work with introduced us to a product that we love that actually has a ransomware guarantee. And I think that's one of the other things you need to ask your providers. What is their level of confidence? What are they standing behind in regards to warranties? Next would be insider threat protection. We do see a lot of these data leaks and hacks and Panama Papers and Paradise Papers. A lot of it has to do with insiders that have been unfortunately turned and selling data. So bring that back to 2 tabs back, and security awareness, important for training that you have policies in your employment contracts. The Caribbean is a large target. They know that we have a lot of assets under management, we have a lot of information, and there are a lot of dark web folks who are targeting different organizations and industries in the Caribbean. So happy to discuss this a bit more offline if anyone would like some more intel. The last thing on the circle there is security intelligence. Whether you reach out to us, other folks, we can give you lots of people depending on where your locale is. You really shouldn't go it alone. And I think that's another thing when people are looking at GDPR audits, they're going to find out what sources did you go to, what industry experts did you speak with. And it doesn't mean you have to spend a lot of dollars. You can just show that you've done the homework. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways for us, is this isn't something that should be considered a negative. It should be something that we should all be looking at how we can improve what we communicate with our clientele in the tourism industry. So I know that leaves us a bit of time for question and answers, and I have a few other miscellaneous things that I'm happy to touch on, but I really wanted to open this more up to Adriana and the group because I think there's a lot of questions out there that maybe we can help with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to open up our Q&A session. So if any of you have any questions that you'd like to pose, we could either try, you can virtually lift your hand, and we'll try to see if we can open up the mic so that you can say something and ask the question, or just go ahead and text any questions that you have in the chat box. So let's start with the ones that were submitted via chat. We have one question from Will Oakley, and he's asking, what do we do with existing data right now, with the data that they currently have?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think it falls into the same bucket, unfortunately, as any new data. They have to audit it. They have to make sure it's secure, protected, and that they have a policy for how long they retain it, who has access to it, and if anything was to be breached, what's their incident response plan around it. Again, I would drive you to the ICO website where they would say, what does that mean? How do I audit my existing data? Is that Brian, is that...
One of the things that I would add there, to add to Polly, is that it's, aside from auditing, it is tough to go back to your existing database, and get it into compliance. One of the things that, as we were building in compliance into our platform, we actually built a feature for our customers that we kind of just gave to them, because it was something that we had to build for ourselves, which was a way to go back and engage the folks that are in your database in a way that feels really good, that's really thoughtful, is transactional, and then start getting some of the segmentation data through that engagement. So if you can start getting anonymized IP addresses, which then you can segment by EU and non-EU, at the very least, you can segment out your non-EU from EU. So if you find that, only a small percentage of your marketing database is EU, maybe 5%, or maybe even smaller, you can kind of continue doing business as usual without such an immediate shift with all of your non-EU folks, because technically GDPR doesn't require you to be under the same regulations and rules for the non-EU folks. So, I mean, what I would suggest is figuring out how do you go back, engage those folks, start getting, in still the compliant way, some of that location data so you can start some of that segmentation. Because for that segmentation, one of the key things, I think Polly talked about this too, is it's not just based on passports or address, it's based on presence, meaning that, even if you're not an EU citizen, but you transacted with that person while they were in the EU, they're still covered under GDPR, right?
Yeah, Brian, that's a good point. I think it's important for everyone to know that the UK and even the USA are next. So this is, again, it's good to know your segmentation, and you can even put on forms if people fill in, are you an EU citizen? That's great to help you drill down. But at the end of the day, you'll have to start treating everyone as though they are in the same bucket, because it's impossible to, lots of folks have multiple passports. They may be transacting through an IP address in one area, but yet their home address is in another. So I think it is important that we look at this as just best practice going forward, and where you can, go back and see if there's any holes in your data where you just didn't have enough background on the information. And I think, Brian, where you mentioned being able to present back to people who want to know what do you have held, that's also very helpful. I'm not sure how practical or expensive it might be for people to be able to handle personal inquiries rather than taking a sweeping umbrella approach and then work within their own associations. I think one of the things we're finding in the Cayman Islands is people are getting together and having thought leadership lunch and learns, and they're sharing policies and they're sharing information amongst tour operators so that they can actually combine efforts, and that will help if the regulator wants to see effort, an A for effort, I guess.
Okay, so let's see. We have a question here from Misha Joseph, and she would like to know, how often should data audits run?
We tend to say that annual would be the minimum, and a lot of folks do it in line with their business continuity procedures, or it depends what level of business. If they're an audited business, and they're working with KPMG or Ernst & Young, Deloitte, PwC, it'll be in line with your fiscal year. Otherwise, you could do it in line with like your continuity planning, but at minimum, it should be once a year.
Okay. Let's see. Our Director of Membership is asking, Marta Valdivia, she's asking, when asking for consent to send marketing materials, is there a set period of time that has to be defined in the consent?
Not that I've found. I haven't found a thing that, I think a lot of it has to be in order to move on to the next area of your website. If it's internet marketing, you have to gather the consent before you move on to collecting the data. So it's instantaneous. If it's,
yeah, that's what,
right.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I found as well. I mean, it seems a bit fuzzy there. I think the, kind of the language reads that it can't be forever, right? So it can't be something that's there until the end of days. But it needs to be within a time frame that, makes sense for you continuing the conversation. So, if you're thinking about marketing, if you think of the difference between doing email blasts, which are not very conversational, right? They're kind of just one-offs. That wouldn't be in compliance with that, right? If you have something that, if you're shifting and it's a little bit more conversational, meaning that it's expected, this is tied back and it is triggered based on something, that's more in compliance with the underlying goal of making sure that you're using that communication channel, whether it's email, SMS, anything else, that it's more conversational. So again, if it feels conversational, then you're in compliance. If it doesn't feel conversational, you're probably not in compliance.
That's a really good point. I just wanted to say that so many travel are finding it difficult to draw the line between data obtained via correct informed consent and then data obtained through legitimate interest. So the consent and legitimate interest are two different processing conditions, and they have two different legal bases. So I think it's important for the tourism and travel and leisure sector to be able to look at the difference of how and understand the process so that you are in accordance. And all, again, you have to do is show that you're actually being accountable and that you're being aware.
Okay. Let's see. We have another question from Bruce. How do we reconcile requirements of GDPR against various know your customer guest requirements of local governments?
Again, the answer is the local government will always supersede any GDPR. You have to go with your local government mandates. So know your customers, usually more in the financial industry, real estate. It has to do with typically commercial transactions. So those will always supersede, but they'll dovetail into GDPR. I mean, I guess the question is, know your customers typically utility bill, passport, known address, and bank reference. Those will still be the highest level of mandated protocols, and GDPR is how you then use that information.
Okay.
And what you might do with it.
Alrighty, let's see. Next question here is from Sylvia. She asks, if we send an email to our EU database requesting to confirm that they want to continue to receive promotional/news-related information, what will we have to do with the people who are not responding, either confirming or opting out? Would they have to be removed by default?
That's a good question, and I think the answer is going to be you have to put a timeline on it. And I think if to be on the safe side, I would remove persons if they don't have implicit consent, and that's part of the GDPR mandate.
Yeah, and the thing I would add there too, and this is the tricky bit, is that technically, even today, you're not really supposed to do that. You're not supposed to send an email out of the blue to ask if someone, will allow you to continue sending them email, which is kind of this weird catch-22. It's definitely not something that you should be doing after GDPR goes in effect. That's actually one of the things that they've called out as kind of a no-no of doing that type of outreach where it's unwarranted, not in conversation with someone, just kind of an out of the blue email. So that's a little bit tricky. One of the better ways to actually get some of the segmentation is going by an anonymized IP address, meaning that location presence is one of the ways that they called out as something that is a good way that when you're in conversation with someone and in a transactional way, if you can get their location while you're in conversation with them by IP address, with the caveat that you have to anonymize that IP address because that's considered personal information, that will help you get your existing database into a position at the very least, which Polly made a good point, proving that you're trying to get into compliance, right? I think that's I'll just really push hard on Polly's point there is that I think that's key, is that making sure that you're showing steps that you're trying to be a good steward of data, you're trying to segment your database correctly, and also to Polly's point, the long term is that this will probably affect your entire database anyway. So you're going to have to, for now, you potentially treat them, separately, EU and non-EU, but ultimately, like the longer term is that you're going to have to eventually treat everyone's data and their communication preferences similarly.
Okay, let's see. We have another question from Will. If someone passes you a business card do you need to ask them to opt in?
That's a great question. I mean, I do a lot of trade shows, and I
Yeah.
have to say that if someone asks me a business card and it goes into the bin before I leave the show, no, I don't have to do anything. But if it goes into my database, or I'm going to thank them for dropping by my booth, or I'm going to put them into any kind of Christmas card or marketing follow-up, yes, I have to ask them consent. Probably it would be digitally. We would put them into the database, and then we would say, it was nice meeting you. At that point, they would be presented with a level of a consent form. So yes, I think if you're going to intend to keep the information, you have to qualify it.
Yeah, and I think I think the thing to add there is that there's a really big difference between transactional and marketing, particularly when it comes to email, right? So this is definitely not shutting down transactional conversations. And it's actually carved out, right? They give specific examples of what transactional means and what marketing means, right? So, for example, if someone, buys something and they have to get a receipt, you can email them that receipt, right? Like that's 100% expected. It's allowed. Similarly, if someone gave you a business card and you shot them an email, that's expected. It's transactional, but to Polly's point, if it actually veers into someone gave you a business card and then you're adding them to, say, your newsletter, that would be something that is not GDPR compliant.
Or you'd have to have the consent form at that first communication, asking them if they'd like to be part of the newsletter.
Okay. We have a question from Hassel. He says, I know that local law on data protection supersedes, but how do we deal with having to hold info for a period of 7 years? How do we manage this when it is run counter the EU Data Protection Act?
Again, I think he tends to answer his own question there, because there's a lot of businesses that don't have to retain data for 7 years. It's a matter of either tax or a matter of regulatory compliance. But if you don't have to, I know quite a few insurance companies that ditch the certain information after 36 months because they don't want to be a custodian of information any longer than they have to, because then you would have to prove to a court of law what you're doing with it. So I think the question depends. If you're in a tourism sector, you have to decide how real that information is and how long you want to retain it for. I think one of the habits people had in the past was to keep everything for always, just in case. And again, this GDPR is a bit of a positive because it is helping us realize that's probably not very practical. And it really does help us look at things in the real world. How real do we want to be with data, and how long do we really intend to use it for? So I don't know what business Hassel's in, but I'd say that if you are regulated and you have to keep data, then GDPR takes second to your local mandate.
And I'd add to that, aside from being the good steward of data, just to the point of the value of that data coming from a marketing perspective. If you haven't talked to, let's just take this outside of the digital world. If you haven't talked to someone in 2-3 years, right? You can't just race up to someone and say, hey, why don't you come stay with me, right? Just from a marketing value, like that doesn't really work. And it still happens today. There's tons of hotels and destinations that's kind of what they do, and they just do that because they've done that forever. But it's really not great. It's hurting your digital reputation, whether it's email sends that bounce or go unopened. And from a marketing value, it's not really doing your brand any good, right? Just, yelling at someone out of the blue unexpectedly, right? That type of approach isn't all that valuable to begin with. So being a good steward of data, is one thing, but then also, figuring out, how do you prune your database accordingly, or alternatively, how do you stay in better communication in a more transactional, conversational way with a wider swath of your audience?
That's an excellent point, Brian, because I do find that just being in the digital world, day in and day out, people are burdened with email volume. And I think this may actually cause a paradigm shift where people are going to rely on different forms of advertising or communicating outside of email. because everyone knows that there's just a less and less click-through rate on what's happening in email. So it does give people an opportunity to look at how they might be a bit more clever with staying in touch with folks that people don't find is just bundling up their email boxes.
Okay, and this is going to be our last question. We have a few more, but not to worry. Brian and Polly will reach out to you and answer any concerns you might have. But the last question is Nicole Moore's, and she is asking, is there anything specific that you should request from an employee who is an EU citizen in order to process their data in the Caribbean? For example, by them signing a consent upon employment?
That's an excellent question, and obviously we have a lot of EU employees, and so it's one of the first things we did was look at our onboarding and our exit process. And yes, we have made some changes in our HR policy to make sure that the interview process, even for accepting people's CVs, we let them know that how long we'll retain their copy of their resume, and if they're not contacted within a certain period of time, we'll be removing them from our HR database. It is an excellent question because the internal view of GDPR is just as important as what you're doing to the external world. So yes, take a look at those policies, write a few more sentences on interview, acceptance, and exit interview.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Brian and Polly, for joining us and for providing this wonderful information. As we had said at the beginning of the webinar, the recording of this, as well as the PowerPoint presentation and Brian and Polly's contact information, will be emailed to you within 48 hours, and it can also be found on our website. So, guys, thank you again so much for taking of your time to talk to us.
Our pleasure. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, everyone.
All righty, and we will hopefully see you guys in June here in Miami for Chief Taste of the Caribbean and Caribbean 305. Hope to see you soon, and have a wonderful week. Thank you.